to On My Way to Wealth, the podcast where busy Gen Xers can learn financial tips as they navigate life on their way to wealth. And now, please join your host, Luis Rosa.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of On My Way to Wealth. My name is Luis Rosa, and I'm your host. I want to talk to you about home buying versus home renting today. This is an ages-long argument, and as I'm sure you've seen, there are arguments for both. From a numbers perspective, people can show you why buying a house is a bad idea. Some other people show you why a house is a great investment versus renting, and why renting is just throwing away money versus why renting is a better option, right? So there's arguments on both sides, and there's a lot of data to make a case for either point. So I just wanted to share some of my personal thoughts on it and hopefully help you at least make that decision for yourself if you haven't already done so. So let's compare some of the pros and cons before we get into whether or not we think it's a good idea, right? So the American dream has always been known as owning a home for as long as I could remember, as long as I've been in this country. Home ownership has been the American dream. So it's something that a lot of people definitely strive for. So why is that, right? So buying a home could be meaningful to people in very different ways, not just economically. It can mean a lot to people just feeling like they've made it, they accomplished the American dream, a sense of security, a sense of success, a sense of just self-worth, right? Because they accomplished something that's been in their mind for as long as they can remember. It's been portrayed as the American dream. So when you buy a house, obviously the first thing is that you own it. So now you have more say in what happens with that property, as opposed to when you rent. You might have a landlord or homeowners association or something that might put some restrictions on you in terms of what you can do in that apartment, right? When you live in your house, obviously there are still some guidelines that you need to follow in terms of how long of a fence you can build, et cetera, outside, depending on where you live and the local rules. But in general, if you want to paint your walls inside of your bedroom orange, you can, right? There's nobody telling you not to because you own your home. So obviously, as long as you're not doing anything like structural, knocking down walls and things of that sort that might mess up the integrity of the house, you pretty much have free range inside your home, whatever you want to do, right? So you want to paint the bedroom purple and orange, you can go ahead and do that. So that is one of the advantages. It's yours. You have more say in it. Another thing is the possible appreciation of the property, the value of it over time, right? You might buy a home for $250,000 and maybe you stay in it 10 years and then 10 years later it's worth $350,000, right? And you might have that $100,000 in appreciation and the value and cash out into a nice amount, right, when you sell it. So that is the possibility as well. Also, potential tax credits. Now, before the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, a lot of people automatically assumed that when you bought a home, you had a whole bunch of tax advantages. And that was right for most people because I'll tell you a little bit about how the tax system works just so that you briefly understand. When you file your taxes, you have an option of either itemizing your deductions. I'll tell you what that is in a little bit, or taking the standard deduction. So think about it this way. The government gives you a standard amount that you can deduct from your taxable income. So for example, let's say that you are a married couple and you made $100,000. For tax year 2020, the standard deduction is $24,800. So let's say your taxable income comes out to be $100,000 or your adjusted gross income, right? The IRS says, on the house, no questions asked, you can deduct $24,800 from that income. So your actual taxable income after the standard deduction is really only $75,200. So even though you made $100,000, you're only paying taxes on $75,200. Now, the other thing the IRS says is you can itemize your deductions so that if your total itemizations add up to more than the standard deduction, then you have the opportunity to then take that bigger number and deduct it from your taxable income. So, for example, let's say somebody owned a $400,000, let's say they bought a $500,000 house, put $100,000 down, so 20%, they borrowed $400,000. And let's say they got a very nice interest rate, 3.5%. That is $14,000 in mortgage interest in year one. And let's say that they also had, for example, $5,000 in property taxes, right? That's 19,000. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act put a limit on the amount of property taxes and state income taxes that you can deduct, put a cap on 10,000 for married couples. Before you were able to take advantage of a much larger amount, whatever those numbers were, now it's capped at 10,000. So even if your property taxes are 12,000 and you paid 8,000 in state income tax, which totaled 20, back in the day, you would have had $20,000 of itemized deductions. Now you're capped at the 10. But let's say you meet that cap, so it's 10,000, and then you also had $14,000 in mortgage interest. That's already 24,000. So let's say that you also donated stuff to charity, say another $3,000 to your church and some charity, that's 27,000, and so on and so forth. So if your itemized deductions end up being higher, you end up able to take the higher number from your taxable income. So you always have the option of choosing the standard deduction versus the itemized deduction. If the itemized deductions are higher, you go ahead and do that. But like I was saying before, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act capped the amount of property taxes and state income taxes. They call it SALT, state and local tax, that you can deduct to $10,000 for joint couples and $5,000 if you're doing single or married, filing separate. So that creates a big problem for a lot of people, especially people that live like in California, New York, very high income tax states and property tax states, where they can no longer take as much of a deduction as they were in the past. Now, when you couple that with the fact that the standard deduction pretty much almost doubled, um, it makes it to a point where some people do not get any benefit tax-wise from owning a home, because the standard deduction is much bigger than any itemized deductions that they would have had. So to give you an example, say in my case, I live in the state of Nevada. Uh, Property taxes are pretty low, and so are home prices for the most part. You can still get like a $250,000, $300,000 house. So let me give you an example. Let's say a couple here found a house for $250,000. They put 20% down, which is 50 grand, and they borrow $200,000. And let's say that, using the same example, their interest rate is 3.5%. That's $7,000 in year one in interest, and their property taxes might only be $3,000. That's only $10,000. Their standard deduction is $24,800. So they would still need to have $14,800 of other deductions like charitable contributions and allowable medical expenses and things of that sort, so that that number would have to be bigger than the 24.8. So in this case, although they are property owners, they have property taxes, they have mortgage interest, the standard deduction is still a bigger number. So there is no tax benefit in that scenario for that couple, whether they owned or rented, right? So something to consider, because it's not as easy to get a tax deduction anymore because of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act capping the state and local tax and also raising the standard deduction. So something that you definitely want to consider before you purchase home. Speak with your accountant or your financial planner to make sure that you're taking full advantage, or that at least you understand whether or not it does in fact benefit you. Because I've seen a lot of people who have ended up being very surprised because they had no idea that this is how it works now. And then they were expecting this huge tax refund at the end of the year because they owned a home, and they were just misinformed, unfortunately. So something very important for you to consider. Now, as far as renting, what do you get as a renter? You don't get to have a lot of say in the property. However, you also don't have as many expenses. For the most part, you pay your rent and maybe some utilities depending on where you live, right? But you don't have to pay property insurance. You don't have to pay property taxes. You don't have to worry about coming up with a large sum of money to put down as a down payment. And you don't have to worry about repairs. So when you live in a an apartment and your toilet stops working, you can call your landlord, right? Or the management office if you live in an apartment complex, and they send somebody out and fix that for you because that's all included in the rent. When you have a house and your toilet stops working, you're going to be making a trip to Home Depot or Lowe's or something, right? Or calling a plumber yourself because the buck stops with you. So that's another thing to consider. The other thing is liability. If you own a house, which that's why you have to insure it. What if somebody trips and falls right outside of your house? Now you might become liable uh, for a lawsuit because maybe they might say that you didn't fix a crack in the sidewalk and they tripped, something like that. When you're a renter, that's on the landlord, not on you. Also, when people own homes, I mean, I know a lot of people with houses, and to me, it just always seems like there's always a project. Like it just never ends. Even people that have bought like new houses, it always seems like there's always a house project year after year that they need to do. There's some home improvement. There's something that they always need to get accomplished. And I'm not talking repairs per se. It's just something they want to do. They want to upgrade bathrooms and kitchens and putting up a new deck and get a pool, whatever it is. It just always seems to be added expenses on top of the fact that you're already paying a mortgage with property taxes, insurance, and then you have repairs every once in a while, plus expenses related to projects that you want to take care of. And also, when you own a home, you don't have the flexibility to move right away because if you did decide that, you know what, we don't want to live here anymore, well, you still have a mortgage. You still got to make those payments. You have to put your house on the market. It has to get appraised. You have to have people come over, have an open house, find a qualified buyer. And then once you have all that, then you can finally go to closing, typically within a month or two, right? Depending on how fast things move. So it's not as flexible for you to leave. Obviously, when you rent, you also have a lease and you are tied to that lease. But when that lease is over, you can pretty much go, right? So it gives you that flexibility. So it depends a lot on your lifestyle. So when people say, is it a good idea to buy? Sometimes the decision to buy a house could make no sense on paper, but it could be a great idea otherwise. So just because something doesn't make sense on paper, just because something is deemed not to be a good quote unquote investment, although you shouldn't look at your primary residence as an investment because real estate doesn't always necessarily go up as we've seen in 2008, right? A lot of people lost a lot of value in their homes and they weren't able to sell them or refinance and perhaps had to foreclose or do a short sale. But think about it this way. What about you might have desirability for a specific school district. So you want to buy in that area because you're going to have your kids go to that school, right? It might be close to your family, it might be closer to work. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why you would buy separate from the finances of it. You know, there are people who like to move a lot. You know, she's gonna kill me, but my wife's one of them. We probably move like every 2 years, so um, it's not feasible to own a primary residence when you just pick up and move. Let's try the other side of town and even out of state, right? If you have the flexibility to do so. So those are things to consider. Also, when you rent, if you consider, if any of you are familiar with the term opportunity cost, this is my economics major now coming about. But basically, opportunity cost is the lost opportunity. So to give you an example, let's say that your mortgage payment was going to be $2,500 a month, but the rent payment for an apartment in that area is $1,500 a month. You're spending an extra $1,000 on that mortgage. So the economist in me would say, well, that's $1,000 opportunity cost because if you rent it, you can take the $1,000 and then do something else with it, like invest in it, right? And then this is where the debate comes in. Are you better off having a home appreciating at, say, 3 to 5% a year for X amount of years versus renting and then investing that $1,000, right? And I can run numbers both ways and tell you, oh, this is better based on interest rates and rates of return, blah, blah, blah. But in reality, if you think about it, well, if you're looking at it from the opportunity cost standpoint, how likely were you to really invest that money? If it might look good on paper, but if you rented instead of buying, were you really going to save the difference between what you were paying in rent and what the mortgage is? Are you doing it now, for example? So if you're renting and you could afford $1,000 higher, are you in fact every single month without fail investing that $1,000, right? And obviously you don't know what the investment returns are going to be because the stock market can also go down, right? So that's another thing for you to consider: opportunity cost, lifestyle, um, having the school system that you want, being close to family members. You might want to leave something in the family just because, I know people that have houses in certain areas that are very desirable and they just want to keep it in the family. So it might not make sense from a financial standpoint, but it's also leaving part of the legacy for the family. So there are times where buying might seem terrible, and there are times where renting might seem terrible. There are people who typically you hear people say, well, if I rent, I'm just throwing away money. But it's funny because sometimes people say that, but then they're leasing a car. We're like, well, you're renting your car long term, right? But it's not necessarily the case. When you're renting, you're not throwing away money. You need a place to live. So you're getting something in return. You're getting shelter, right? You're getting a place to stay for you and your family. So you're not throwing away money just because you're renting. So, people can sit here all day long and do back and forth numbers and saying, well, this is the reason why buying is better. This is the reason rent is better. This is a decision that should be made individually, because you might make a decision that doesn't look good on paper financially, but it's the right decision for you. So this is when it's very important for you to sit down with a financial planner and figure out, obviously, if you can afford the home, if you're considering buying, go over the pros and cons, find out why exactly are you trying to buy this, and see if it makes sense for you. Because frankly, there are times where I've sat down with clients and it made sense for them to buy. And there are clients that are just completely happy just renting and they just have no interest in owning a property. They don't want the hassle. They don't want the maintenance. They don't want the liability. They just want to live in a place, pay a fixed fee, and have everything else taken care of, right? And then invest the difference. So it depends. It really does depend. So sorry to disappoint if some of you were hoping that I told you to go one way or the other. So thank you all for tuning in. If you have any questions, please send me an email at luis@onmywaytowealth.com. And I hope to see you in the next episode. Thank you for listening to On My Way to Wealth. If you have any questions, please send me an email at luis@onmywaytowealth.com. The information provided here is for information and education purposes only. The opinions expressed herein are solely those of myself, unless otherwise specifically cited. Material presented is believed to be from reliable sources, and no representations are made by my firm or myself about other parties' information or accuracy or completeness. All information or ideas provided should be discussed in detail with a financial advisor, accountant, or legal counsel prior to implementation. Thank you.